From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The fallout continues from the release last week of Special Counsel Robert Hur's report on his investigation of President Biden's mishandling of classified documents. How bad is the political damage? Plus, Donald Trump riles U.S. allies in Europe as he implies he might not come to the aid of a NATO treaty ally if it is attacked by Russia, but hasn't spent enough on defense. What does this tell us about Donald Trump's foreign policy if he returns to the White House? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and I'm here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kate Batchelder Odell. Welcome to you both. Well, the political news never stops these days, and over the weekend, there was more regarding Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Let's start with the fallout from Special Counsel Robert Hur's report, which explains his decision not to prosecute the president for willfully, and he used that word willfully, retaining and sharing classified documents. And the reason he gave, in part for not indicting, was the fact that a jury would not convict a, quote, sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory, unquote. Democrats denounced her for those words. And let's listen to White House General Counsel Bob Bauer this weekend on Meet the Press.
This is a report that went off the rails. It's a shabby work product. Let's take a step back. It starts with a legal conclusion that was foregone from the very beginning. The investigation could have been concluded in 2 or 3 months. It went on for over 15 months. And so along with the legal conclusion comes this flood of characterizations, factual misstatements, pejorative comments about the president that are inconsistent with DOJ policy and norms, and that, as you see, over the last 48 hours have been widely criticized by legal experts. This is not what prosecutors do. It is shoddy work product.
Those critics, Kim, include mostly Democratic commentators. But I would say, first of all, the legal conclusion was not foregone. Now, he wouldn't have indicted a sitting president, but Hur could have said, if he weren't a sitting president, I would recommend that he be indicted for this. Instead, he said no, he would not, even under those circumstances. But is Bauer right that Hur violated Justice Department rules and procedures?
I would argue no. I would say Bauer is wrong. And here's why. Because there's been a lot of Democrats who have been comparing this to Jim Comey and saying that this is similar to Jim Comey standing up and giving that infamous press conference where he said that the FBI was not going to recommend going ahead with this, but that Clinton had, with her own mishandling of classified information, been extremely careless. One problem with that is that Comey isn't a prosecutor. Comey was an investigator. And as we pointed at the time, it wasn't his job to make a decision about whether or not charges were warranted or not. He decided to take that into his own hands. Special counsels, by contrast, are given a very specific brief to decide whether to bring charges and then to write a confidential report to the Attorney General, giving their reasons either for pursuing or declining. And in this case, what Hur did is he not only said he wasn't going to bring charges, he laid out the evidence for why they might, but then he explained his reasons for not. And he explained that one of the biggest reasons was that he was concerned that he was dealing with a target who had a very poor memory and that the jury might take that into account and also feel that Mr. Biden was a well-meaning, sympathetic elderly man, therefore a sympathetic defendant. And he wasn't sure he could win the case. And so he said he wasn't going to do it. That's exactly what prosecutors are supposed to do. We would hope that those reports aren't always made public, but it was likely this was always going to leak. And in this case, Merrick Garland decided to simply release it.
Yeah, it's important to understand, I think, that a normal prosecutor investigating, let's say a U.S. attorney, and let's say that he's investigating a subject for a crime and decides not to prosecute. Well, in the normal course of work, that prosecutor would not disclose the reasons to the public.
At least not publicly, right?
You might tell the head of the criminal division, or you would tell
Correct.
the deputy AG or the AG. But you would not say, well, we investigated this guy to a fairly well, and I'm not indicting, and here's the reason. Okay, that's regular procedure. A special counsel is very different. He is tasked under the regulation for a special counsel to come up with a report to submit to the Attorney General. Here's what we found. And here's why we did or didn't decide to indict. And of course, if there's a decision to indict, then it all shows up, the evidence, in a public charge. But the AG then can keep it confidential. He's not obliged to release it. But the way these things have gone in recent years, no matter which party's running the Justice Department, is that an attorney general decides, I really should disclose this because otherwise it's going to be leaked anyway, and then we'll get accused of covering up. So you might as well make this public. But I want to make one other point to Kate, and that is that Hur actually was obliged to explain and use this language in the report. He had no choice but to explain it, because he says in the report that Biden willfully retained and then shared that classified information. That is, in fact, criminal behavior under the classified statutes. So then you're left with the question of, well, why didn't you indict? And he didn't indict because he thought couldn't get a conviction with a jury. And here's why he didn't think he could get a conviction. And a prosecutor is obliged not to bring an indictment if he doesn't think that he can reasonably get a conviction.
Right. I mean, and if you take a step back, think about what a polarized moment we're currently living through. And you have Donald Trump, who is under indictment for his handling of classified materials. And there has been half the country wondering, well, Joe Biden had these documents near his Corvette in his house. Why isn't he facing the same scrutiny? So in the event that this special counsel report was going to become public, to your point, I think it is a tonic to the country to explain exactly why he won't face charges for that activity. So I think it's not only was he obligated to do it, but I think he said something that every voter paying attention is aware of, which is that Joe Biden is an elderly man with a questionable memory. And so why wouldn't that be part of what the public explanation of why Biden is not going to face the same scrutiny?
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the political fallout, which is continuing from the release of Mr. Hur's report when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal with Kim Strassel and Kate O'Dell. Kim, let's talk a little bit more about the fallout that has happened politically and whether or not this Hur report and its comments about the president's mental faculties is a tipping point, a potential tipping point for the Democrats as they consider whether to, I guess, paddle over the falls with Joe Biden as the nominee, if that's in fact what happens here. Obviously, the president is more or less unchallenged in the primaries right now. Dean Phillips, the congressman, is challenging him, but hasn't gotten any traction. So by March 5th and Super Tuesday, President Biden will probably have a majority of the Democratic delegates. So any decision for an alternative to the president for the Democratic nomination this year would have to start with the president stepping down and saying, look, I'm decided not to run, and then opening the process up for delegates to decide at the convention. There wouldn't be many primaries that could be contested because there's only a handful of states where the deadline for filing for the primary ballot still hasn't been reached. But you've seen stories in the press suggesting that it's no longer impossible that something like that could happen if Joe Biden decided to step down. And I know there's a lot of Democrats who are really, really worried and understand that this is a big, big problem now. His age and mental acuity, declining mental acuity, is a huge political problem.
To be clear, the majority of Democrats are still rallying around, at least publicly. You heard Bob Bauer on TV. Of course, that's his job. Co-chair Mitch Landrieu, the co-chair of the Biden campaign, was out on the Sunday shows. The media is closing ranks. I saw a long story today in the Washington Post explaining that it was so unfair that Joe Biden had to do that interview on that day because he was in the midst of dealing with the Israel fallout crisis. That was the excuse for why he might not have been at the top of his game. Eric Holder defending him, Kamala Harris. But you are beginning to see those cracks. And I was really struck by Paul Begala, the former Clinton advisor. He had a hilarious quote. He said, look, I'm a Biden supporter and I slept like a baby last night. I woke up every 2 hours and wet the bed. This is terrible for Democrats. And he said anyone with a functioning brain knows that. And I think that's what everyone is understanding inside. And so that is why you are now seeing headlines like the one that's now out on Politico saying Democrats might need a plan B. Here's what it looks like. And laying out those steps that you mentioned. As you note, by the end of this month, the filing deadlines will be passed in all but 6 states. And so you'd have to get all the way to June, and Biden would have to willingly step aside. And that would set off an extraordinary horse race. But also remember, there are a lot of Democrats who've been waiting in the wings for just such a potentiality. Gavin Newsom and J.B. Pritzker in Illinois. There'd be plenty of people who could step up and do it. What I think you're going to see now is a long sustained pressure campaign behind the scenes on Biden to rethink this decision.
That's fascinating. So you think there will be quiet pressure, Kim? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that there are some guys like Paul Begala, never known for his restraint ever anyway, who are going to be public and say it out loud. But I think there's going to be more people going to Joe and Jill, who obviously is a big decider in this whole question, and making the argument for why it would be much better for Joe Biden's broader legacy to bow out of his own decision.
Yeah, Kate, the argument, though, is that the likelihood is for inertia to set in and the Democrats to say, well, hey, it's just more complicated to get rid of the president, to urge him to ease him out and go through the uncertainty of an open convention than just to ride it out and see what happens, particularly if the president is reluctant to step aside. And of course, not to mention the First Lady, Jill Biden, who came out and defended the president this week and said, how dare people question his memory. And of course, I think she likes the life. It's not a bad gig living in the White House and traveling around Marine One. I'll take that commute up to Delaware over the Amtrak. I don't say that with any malice. It's just simply, I think, the case. It's not a bad life. And once you're there, you don't want to give it up. But the thing I'm looking for, Kate, is whether or not any Democrats of note actually take the next step and go public here and say, look, there's just too big a risk for us to go in with this president. He needs to rethink it. He's running the risk of helping to reelect Donald Trump, and he is going to throw away his entire legacy if that would happen.
Yeah, I think Democrats, like you said, not really appreciating the risks that are coming to them if they continue down this path. One story we have today is Kamala Harris saying she's ready to step into the breach if called upon. And when Nikki Haley, the Republican running against Trump, came to visit us in December, she said President Kamala Harris was something that sent a chill down everyone's spine. And I thought it was a good line and captured how people think about potentially voting for President Kamala Harris, because they really understand that that's what they're voting for if they vote for Biden. So I think that is just a huge risk of continuing on the current path that Democrats have to think about as they figure out where to go in this inflection point.
Probably not going to happen, but certainly it is something that is being talked about behind the scenes among all Democrats. All right, let's turn to other news this weekend, and that's what Donald Trump said about the NATO alliance and how he handled it in the first term. Let's listen.
They all owed money, and they wouldn't pay it. I came in, I made a speech, and I said, you got to pay up. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills. And the money came flowing in.
Well, the money came flowing in. Well, not quite, but there's no question that more money did come in. Some of the allies did start to spend more to try to meet their 2% of GDP on defense obligation, mutual commitment made in 2014. But that comment by Trump earned the rebuke from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, saying that it would potentially put at risk European and American soldiers if it encouraged Russia to do something. And Nikki Haley also criticized the comment as well. But most Republicans, Kate, fell in line on this one. And you've seen the senators and so on say, no big deal. This is just Trump being Trump and talking about his success in getting NATO allies to contribute more. What do you think?
Well, Paul, just as a purely political matter, quickly, Joe Biden is having arguably the worst week of his entire presidency. And that's a competitive field when you consider the Afghanistan withdrawal, the invasion of Ukraine. It's a long list. But then here comes Trump wading in to say that Russia should be able to do whatever the hell they want if the Europeans don't pay. It's just an enormous unforced political error. And if he loses in the fall, this kind of lack of discipline, I think, will, of course, explain a lot of it. But On the merits, I think you will always have some explainers saying, well, he was just telling a story and he's not serious about it. And NATO has changed. I think it changed more after the invasion of Ukraine than it did because of anything Trump did.
That is for sure.
You do have now about 11 of 31 countries that are meeting their 2% commitment. It's not excellent, and some of these militaries are really down to a pathetic size and readiness and equipment, but you do have them moving toward a better spot. But just quickly, I mean, in all of our discussions about NATO and how the Europeans are freeloaders, well, we also set up NATO for the U.S. to be the lead power in it, and now we're tired of paying that price, and so it leads to all of this cynicism that Trump is stoking.